Cowboy gave his only hat to a native boy. Next day, the whole village protected him. The wasteland was a desolate canvas painted with loneliness, raw regret, and hunted desperation. Jedediah Stone pushed on his horse a wheezing wreck beneath him. Every gust of wind carried the phantom sound of hoofbeats, every shadow the specter of a noose. He was running from the vulture Silas Vance, a man who collected debts in blood. He was a goner if his old posse caught him, and he knew it. But the ghosts chasing Jed weren't all living men. In the shimmering heat, he saw the face of a Cheyenne woman, her silent scream echoing a sin that had paid him in silver and cost him his soul. Ahead, a hidden valley materialized a sanctuary he didn't deserve. He urged his horse forward, seeking refuge. But as the canyon walls embraced him, he had no idea he wasn't just stumbling toward shelter. He was stumbling into a trial, where the only currency that mattered wasn't gold, but the last shred of honor in a broken man's heart. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brass sky. Below it, the wasteland stretched on a desolate canvas painted with loneliness, raw regret, and the hunted desperation of a man who had forgotten what peace felt like. Jedediah Stone pushed onward, his body a map of old pains, his horse a wheezing wreck beneath him. Every gust of wind carried the phantom sound of hoofbeats. Every long, distorted shadow held the specter of a noose. He was running from the vulture. The name Silas Vance was a bitter taste in his mouth. A man who collected debts in blood and saw betrayal as just another tool of the trade. Jed was a goner if that posse caught him, and he knew it. Days of hard riding had frayed him to the bone, leaving nothing but grit and the hollow ache of survival. But the ghosts chasing Jed weren't all living men. In the shimmering heat that danced above the cracked earth, he saw her face. A Cheyenne woman. Her silent scream was a constant echo in the chambers of his soul, a sin he could never outrun. A sin that had paid him in silver and cost him everything else. He'd been younger then, dumber, following orders that felt wrong but paid right. He closed his eyes for a second, the memory sharp as a shard of glass. He'd held the torch. That was a truth that no amount of running could burn away. His horse stumbled, pulling him from the mire of his past. Ahead, the horizon broke. A trick of the light, he thought. A mirage born of thirst and sun-sickness. But it held. A thin, impossible line of green nestled between two colossal stone sentinels. A hidden valley. A sanctuary he had no right to enter. He urged the horse forward, its labored breaths echoing his own. As he passed between the stone pillars, the world changed. The temperature dropped. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sound of the wind was replaced by the gentle murmur of running water. It was real. A pocket of life carved from the heart of desolation. But he was not welcome here. They emerged from the trees and the longhouses like spirits of the earth, their faces impassive, their eyes holding the ancient weary caution of a people who knew what men like him brought. Silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. No one spoke. Their hands rested near axes, near bows. They were a wall of quiet judgment. Jed slid from his horse, his legs threatening to buckle. He raised a single trembling hand, palm open. Just water. He rasped, his throat a desert of its own. Mean, no harm. An elder with a face like carved oak stepped forward. His eyes, dark and piercing, held no mercy. He spoke not to Jed, but to his people, his voice low and guttural, a sound like stones grinding together. Jed didn't need to know the words to understand the meaning. He does not belong. He brings death. Then a flicker of movement. A boy no older than 7 or 8 slipped from behind one of the larger dwellings. He had his mother's curious eyes and a defiant chin. He did not look at Jed with fear, but with a wide, questioning stare. He was Kimi, and his curiosity was the only thing in this entire valley that wasn't a weapon aimed at Jed's heart. That's when the sky began to bleed. The brilliant, ruthless blue of the afternoon bruised into a sickly violet gray. The wind died instantly. An unnatural hush fell over the valley so profound that Jed could hear the frantic pounding of his own heart. A low rumble started a sound that seemed to come from the very marrow of the mountains. The first stone hit the ground with a crack like a pistol shot, then another, and another. Chaos erupted. The villagers scrambled for cover, their shouts swallowed by the escalating roar. It wasn't rain. It was a bombardment. Hailstones, jagged and cruel the size of a man's fist, hammered the earth. They tore through leaves, splintered branches, and struck the ground with murderous force. In the mad dash for safety, the boy Keem tripped and fell in the open clearing. He lay stunned, looking up at the sky as the world exploded around him. Jed saw him. And in that split second, he saw the Cheyenne woman again. He saw the fire. He saw the sin. He didn't think. He acted. A ragged cry was torn from his throat as he lunged forward, covering the distance in 3 desperate strides. He reached the boy and without a moment's hesitation ripped the sweat-stained, battered hat from his own head. His only shield, his last piece of a life he barely recognized, and jammed it onto the boy's dark hair, pulling it down low. He threw his own body over Kem's small, trembling form, becoming a human shield. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded across his back. A stone smashed into his shoulder, another against his skull. He gritted his teeth, the world a roaring, concussive nightmare. He could feel the boy shaking beneath him, could hear his muffled cries. Jed curled tighter, absorbing the brutal barrage, each impact a penance, each blow a prayer. He didn't know how to speak. The sky was falling, and for the first time in a decade, Jedediah Stone was not running from the storm. He was facing it head-on. The fury passed as quickly as it came. The roaring subsided into the sound of 1,000 tiny rivers as the ice began to melt. Jed's world swam the edges, turning dark. He tried to push himself up, but his muscles screamed in protest. His strength was gone, spent in that single, desperate act of protection. He rolled onto his side, a low groan escaping his lips. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him completely was the boy Keemy pushing the battered hat from his eyes, his face a mask of stunned, tear-streaked awe. Around them, the villagers were emerging, their faces unreadable, their forms closing in. They had seen it all. And Jed didn't know if they were coming to save the man who protected their child or to kill the intruder who had trespassed on their sacred ground. Darkness, and the sound of his own ragged breath. That was the first thing Jedediah Stone knew. The world returned to him, not in a flood of light, but in fragments, shards of pain, the burning cold of a poultice on his back, the scent of wood smoke, and something else, something herbal and clean that was alien to his memory. He was floating in a sea of fevered dreams. Faces swam in the gloom above him, framed by dark hair, their features shifting like smoke. He heard voices, a language that felt ancient, like the murmur of a deep river, the words flowing around him without purchase. He didn't understand them, but he understood the tone. It was not gentle. It was a debate, a weighing of his worth. A ghost whispered in the fever fog, the face of the Cheyenne woman from his past, her eyes accusing him. "You burn, but you do not cleanse." Then a cool hand on his forehead. It was firm, not soft. Practical. He forced his eyes open, the world a painful, blurry mess. A woman knelt beside him. It was the boy's mother, Nita. Her face was a mask of grim concentration as she ground herbs in a stone bowl. She met his gaze for only a second, and in her eyes he saw no pity. He saw the cold calculus of a debt being repaid. He tried to speak the word, a dry crackle in his throat. "The boy. He is safe," she said, her English clipped, learned but not lived in. She pressed a cup of bitter, steaming tea to his lips. "You drink? The ice fever is in your blood." He drank. The liquid was fire and earth, and it seemed to chase the chill from his bones, but not the guilt from his soul. Why was she helping him? This felt more foreign than the ambush he'd barely escaped, more unsettling than the vulture's promise of death. Kindness was a language he no longer spoke. Days and nights bled into one another. He was a prisoner of his own broken body, drifting on tides of pain and memory. Sometimes the boy Kemi would slip into the lodge. He would sit silently a few feet away, clutching the battered, misshapen hat Jed had given him. He would just watch, his dark eyes wide with a child's solemn gravity. Once he held out a perfectly smooth gray river stone. Jed's trembling fingers brushed the boy's as he took it. The touch was a spark of warmth in the vast coldness of his isolation. When the fever finally broke, it left him weak but clear-headed. He was sitting up, propped against the lodge's wooden wall, when the elder entered. Chief Black Eagle. His presence filled the space, his silence more potent than any shout. He stood over Jed, his gaze heavy with the weight of generations. Nita stood beside him, her arms crossed. The chief spoke in his own tongue, his voice a low thunder. Nita translated her own voice, flat and devoid of emotion. "He says you are a ghost, a white shadow that fell upon our home." Jed said nothing, his throat tight. "He says the storm was a warning. The sky spirits are angry. You brought its anger here." A long pause. Jed could feel the truth of it. He was a curse. But Nita continued, her eyes fixed on a point just past Jed's shoulder. "The spirits also test the heart. You have the heart of a wolf," he says, "wounded and dangerous. But you shielded the sapling from the ice. The boy is of our blood." The chief met Jed's eyes then, and the weight of his gaze was a physical thing. Nita's translation came softer now. A debt was created. A debt of blood and ice. "We will tend your wounds. We will give you food. When you can stand, you will take your shadow and walk away from this valley. The debt will be paid. You will not return." It was not a reprieve. It was a judgment, a temporary stay of execution. He was not a guest. He was a balance on a ledger, an obligation to be met and then discarded. And yet as he looked at the hard, unyielding face of the chief, Jed felt a flicker of something he hadn't known was possible, a profound, aching respect. This was a law he understood, an action for an action, clean, unforgiving. In the days that followed, the healing was slow. The sharp edges of the villager's suspicion began to dull. A shared glance, a nod. Keme was his shadow, leaving small gifts by his sleeping mat, a hawk's feather, a string of polished seeds, the hat always close by. Jed was a pariah, but he was the boy's pariah. One afternoon, strong enough to stand, he limped to the entrance of the lodge. He looked out at the valley, a sliver of impossible peace in a world that had only ever shown him violence. The sun warmed his face. The air was clean. For the first time in a decade, Jedediah Stone felt the ghost of peace settle on his weary shoulders. But peace, he knew, was a fickle thing. His eyes, trained by years of watching his own back trail, scanned the high-distant ridgeline that bordered the valley. And a new coldness, sharper and more terrifying than the ice fever, coiled in his gut. It was almost invisible. A thin wisp of smoke, lazy and gray, rising against the brilliant blue sky where no smoke should be. It wasn't a cooking fire. It wasn't a hunter's camp. It was a signal. The vulture was circling. And Jed knew with a sickening certainty the storm he had endured was nothing compared to the one he had brought to the doorstep of these people. The peace was a phantom, a ghost of a feeling that vanished the moment Jed saw the smoke. It was a violation, a dirty thumbprint on the clean canvas of the sky. The warmth that had begun to seep into his soul was extinguished, replaced by a familiar gut-deep cold. He was a poison. He had stumbled into this pure, hidden well, and now the contamination of his past was seeping and tainting everything. The vulture was here. He turned from the entrance of the lodge, his limp more pronounced, the weight of his sins returning tenfold. The sanctuary was no longer sanctuary. It was a cage, and the predators were circling. He found them by the central fire pit where Chief Black Eagle was speaking in low tones with Nita. The rest of the village moved with a quiet, deliberate industry, but a new tension hung in the air. They had seen the smoke, too. They knew. Jed stopped before the chief, the firelight casting long dancing shadows that made him look like a broken giant. He didn't need to search for the words. The truth was a hard, simple stone. A fire, he said, his voice a low rasp, on the north ridge. It's my trouble. They've found me. Chief Black Eagle's face, a roadmap of ancient wisdom, did not change. There was no surprise in his dark eyes, only the grim affirmation of what he had known all along. He nodded slowly, a single final gesture. He spoke, his voice the sound of the wind through high canyon rocks. Nita translated, though the meaning was already clear in the old man's gaze. He says a man's shadow always finds him even in the brightest sun. The debt for your life is paid. The debt you owe others is not our concern. I know Jed said the words, tasting like ash. I'm leaving. At dawn, I'll lead them away. Nita's gaze, which had softened in the past days, was now sharp again, flinty with a mother's fear. How many men, she asked, her voice cutting through the solemnity. Enough, Jed answered the single word, heavy with the promise of violence. His name is Silas Vance. He doesn't leave survivors. The unspoken question hung between them, thick and suffocating. What if you don't lead them away? What if they follow you here first? The chief spoke one last time, his words a final, unyielding decree. Nita did not need to translate. The command was universal. Go. Jed retreated to the lodge that had been his sickbed. It now felt like a tomb. He spent the afternoon in a state of quiet, focused despair. He checked the action on his Colt, the cold, familiar weight, a grim comfort in his hand. He cleaned it with a slow, methodical rhythm, the simple task a way to anchor his frantic mind. He was going to die. He knew it with a certainty that left no room for hope. Silas was not a man you faced alone and walked away from, but dying to lead them away from here. It felt like the first clean choice he had made in a lifetime. A good death after a bad life. It was more than he deserved. The pre-dawn light was a wash of faint gray and deep purple when he rose. The village was asleep, the lodges dark and silent. He moved like a wraith, his footsteps muffled on the damp earth. His horse, tended to by the villagers, was stronger, its coat sleek. It nickered softly as he approached, nudging his hand. He saddled the animal, his movements economical, his heart a dull, heavy stone in his chest. This was it, the last ride. He swung himself into the saddle, the movement sending a bolt of fire through his still-healing back. He gritted his teeth and turned the horse toward the valley's entrance. Wait. The voice was small, a whisper in the vast silence. Jed turned. Kemi stood there, a small, solitary figure in the gloom. In his hands he held the battered hat. He walked forward, his bare feet making no sound, and held it up. Jed shook his head. The lump in his throat felt as large as one of the hailstones. You keep it, kid. Looks better on you. The boy pushed it forward again, insistent, his eyes pleading. Then a second figure emerged from the shadows. Nita. She walked to her son, placing a hand on his shoulder before taking the hat from him. She stepped up to Jed's horse, her face unreadable in the dim light. She reached up and pressed the hat into Jed's hand. A man should not meet his spirits with his head uncovered, she said softly. Her gaze was direct, her words holding a strange mix of finality and respect. She then pressed a small deerskin pouch into his other hand. It smelled of earth and herbs. for the road, to quiet the pain. Jed looked down at the simple gifts, a broken hat and a handful of weeds. They felt heavier than all the silver he had ever earned. He looked at the woman and her son, at the life he had saved and the woman who had saved his. He saw no judgment in their eyes now, only a deep, sorrowful understanding. A bond had been forged here, not of friendship, but of something deeper, of sacrifice. He couldn't speak. He simply nodded a single sharp dip of his chin. He settled the hat on his head. It felt different now. Not a shield for himself, but a crown of thorns he wore for them. He nudged his horse forward out of the village, out of the sanctuary. He did not look back. He couldn't. Behind him lay a fragile piece he had come so close to shattering. Ahead on the ridge, the vulture waited. The smoke from his fire was a deliberate, arrogant invitation, a promise. Jedediah Stone, the ghost who had stumbled into grace, now rode out to become a hunter. His target was not Silas Vance. His target was the sins of his own past. And he knew this trail only had two ends: absolution or the grave. The ride up the ridge was a pilgrimage into a hell of his own making. Each jarring step of the horse sent a fresh wave of fire through Jed's battered body, but his mind was strangely, terrifyingly calm. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vivid, the scent of pine and dust, the cold, hard weight of the colt on his hip. He was no longer a man adrift. He was an arrow aimed at a target, accepting the fact that both he and the target would be destroyed upon impact. He clutched the small deerskin pouch Nita had given him. Its earthy fragrance was a tether to the quiet valley below, a stark contrast to the metallic scent of gunpowder that already filled his memory. He wasn't just fighting to lead Silas away. He was fighting to keep the memory of that fragile piece pure. He didn't ride into the vulture's camp. That was a fool's death, not a soldier's. Instead, he found his ground, a narrow pass choked with ancient twisted junipers and granite boulders, a place where the worlds squeezed together, forcing a confrontation, a killing floor. He dismounted, leading his horse into a small crevice, its quiet breathing the only sound besides the wind. He checked his revolver, the 6 rounds seeming pitifully few against the dozen men Silas likely had with him. Then he waited, a statue of grim patience. They came near noon, heralded by the clatter of shod hooves on loose rock and the sound of rough, cruel laughter. They were a blight on the landscape, a pack of hyenas smelling blood. Silas Vance rode at their head, a big man with a predator's smile and eyes as dead and empty as a desert well. He reined in his horse at the mouth of the pass, his smile widening when he saw the lone figure waiting for him. "Well now," Silas boomed, his voice dripping with mock affection. "Look what the buzzards dragged in. I knew you didn't have the stomach to run forever, Jedediah." His men fanned out their rifles, held with casual menace. Jed remained where he was, his hand hovering near his hip. "This trail ends here," Silas Jed said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion that churned in his gut. Silas chuckled a low, ugly sound. "Oh, it ends all right. But not before you tell me where you stashed the rest of the payroll." He leaned forward in his saddle. "And what's this I hear you've been playing house? Found yourself some new pets in a little mud hut village down the way." Jed's jaw tightened. "This ain't about them." "Isn't it?" Silas sneered, his eyes glinting. "I think it is. You always did have a soft spot deep down, like with that squaw at Willow Creek. Crying shame what happened to her after you rode off with the silver. A man can't serve 2 masters, Jed. God and gold. Or in your case, a guilty conscience and a full saddlebag." The old wound, the one he thought couldn't get any deeper, was torn open anew. The vulture knew exactly where to peck. "I'm done talking," Silas Jed said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm not." Silas grinned. He gestured to his men. "He's all yours, boys. Just leave enough to tell me where the money is." Rifles were raised. Hammers clicked back. The world narrowed to the space between heartbeats. The sun beat down. A hawk circled high overhead. Jed's hand closed around the worn grip of his Colt. One for Silas. Maybe one for the man on the left. After that, it was all just noise and pain. He was ready. A sound cut through the tense silence. Not a gunshot. A low, sharp whistle, like the cry of a hawk, but not. One of Silas's men, the one with the greasiest smile, suddenly stiffened. He looked down, a flicker of confusion on his face. A long feathered shaft protruded from his chest. He made a soft gurgling sound and slid from his saddle like a sack of grain. Silence. Shock. What in the... One of the others stammered, his eyes darting wildly. Another whistle. Another man cried out, clutching his throat where a second arrow had found its home. Silas roared, wheeling his horse around, his face a mask of disbelief. "Ambush! Where are they? Show yourselves, you cowardly!" His voice died in his throat. On the high rocks above them, on both sides of the pass, figures had begun to materialize. They hadn't been there a second ago. Now they were everywhere. Silent, unmoving. Warriors, their faces painted not for war, but for judgment. They held bows, not rifles, their forms blending into the stone and shadow. At the highest point stood Chief Black Eagle, his expression as unyielding as the mountain itself. Beside him, with a bow held with practiced ease, was Nita. And further down, nearly hidden behind a juniper, Jed saw a small face peering out, clutching a battered hat. Kame. They had followed him. They hadn't let him go to his death alone. The debt was not simply to heal him and send him away. The debt was to see the threat to its end. Silas Vance stared, his jaw slack, the color draining from his face. The hunter had walked into a den of lions. The vulture who preyed on the weak and isolated was now caught in a trap, surrounded and exposed. Savages, he finally roared, the word echoing uselessly in the sudden deadly silence of the canyon. Rage contorted his features, a wild, cornered fury. "You'll all burn for this." Silas Vance's roar of fury was the last loud sound in the canyon. What followed was a different kind of violence, a silent, disciplined storm. It began with the whisper of arrows. There was no grand charge, no thunder of rifles from the rocks above. Just the thwip of a bowstring, followed by the choked cry of a man clutching his throat. Then another, and another. Silas's men, hardened outlaws used to the chaos of saloon brawls and street shootouts, were completely undone by the terrifying efficiency of their unseen enemy. They spun in circles, firing wildly at the impassive stones, their bullets whining uselessly into the vast emptiness. They were fighting ghosts, and Jedediah Stone was the anchor in their nightmare. He saw it then, the strategy of the warriors. They were not just killing. They were hurting. Their arrows flew with pinpoint precision, forcing the remaining gunmen away from the cover of the rocks, driving them into the open, into the killing floor of the pass where Jed waited. A profound, stunning realization washed over him. They weren't just saving him. They were using him. They were trusting him to hold the line. The first outlaw stumbled into his sights, his face a mask of panic. Jed's Colt barked a single sharp clap of thunder in the eerie quiet. The man fell. Another followed, and Jed's second shot was just as true. This was a different kind of shooting. There was no rage in it, no fear. Just a cold, clean purpose. He was a part of this now, a cog in a machine of deadly justice. His gun, the hammer to their silent cutting blades. In moments the skirmish was over. The canyon floor was littered with the bodies of the vulture's men. Only Silas remained standing beside his horse, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and apoplectic rage. He was alone. Truly alone. He stared up at the silent figures on the rocks. Then his murderous gaze fell upon Jed. His pistol was empty. With a guttural roar that was more animal than human, he drew a massive, gleaming Bowie knife from his belt and charged. "You!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. "This is your fault. You backstabbing, soul-saving coward." Jed met him head-on. There was no room for guns now, only for desperate close-quarters brutality. The clash of Silas's heavy knife against the barrel of Jed's empty revolver rang through the canyon. It was a clumsy, ugly fight, a battle of pure strength and hatred. Silas was bigger, stronger, fueled by a lifetime of unchecked rage. He slammed Jed against a rock wall, the impact jarring the very teeth in his skull. The world swam. Silas's hot, whiskey-sour breath was on his face. "I should have left you to rot in that Texas jail," he snarled, pressing the point of the Bowie knife against Jed's throat. The cold steel bit into his skin. Jed struggled, his arms pinned, his vision starting to tunnel. He was losing. His past in the form of this brute was finally about to choke the life out of him. His fumbling hand, scrabbling for purchase against Silas's chest, brushed against the small deerskin pouch at his belt. Nita's gift. The healing herbs. It wasn't a thought. It was an instinct born of pure desperation. With a final explosive burst of strength, Jed ripped the pouch from his belt, tore it open with his teeth, and flung the contents, a fine, dry powder of pungent, crushed herbs, directly into Silas's face. The vulture screamed. It was a high, thin sound of agony and shock. He recoiled, dropping the knife, his hands flying to his eyes, as the potent dust of the plains, the very earth he had tried to conquer, blinded him. He clawed at his face, stumbling backward, temporarily helpless. It was the only opening Jed needed. He lunged not for his gun, but for the fallen Bowie knife. He scooped it from the dust and rose as Silas staggered toward him, still roaring, still blind. There was no honor in it, no glory, just a grim final necessity. He drove the blade home. Silas Vance, the vulture who had terrorized the territories, fell with a shuddering gasp, his own knife buried to the hilt in his chest. His dead eyes stared up at the sky, unseeing. Silence descended. A profound ringing quiet broken only by Jed's own ragged breathing. He stood over the body of his final demon, his chest heaving, the bitter, clean scent of Nita's herbs filling the air. He had won. He was alive. He looked up. The warriors were descending from the rocks, moving with a fluid grace. They formed a silent circle around him and the body of Silas Vance. Their faces were impassive, their eyes holding the deep, unreadable calm of the mountains. They looked at the dead outlaws. They looked at Jed, covered in blood and dust. Chief Black Eagle approached his footsteps, making no sound. He stopped before Jed, his gaze taking in the scene. He looked at the arrow-felled men at Jed's work, and finally at the body of Silas. The debt of blood and ice had been paid in full. The threat was gone. But as Jed stood there, a ghost in their midst, a new unspoken question hung in the quiet air, as heavy as the silence itself. What do you do with an ally who has won your war but can never truly be one of your own? The canyon held its breath. Jed stood in the circle of silent warriors, the body of Silas Vance, a final ugly punctuation mark in the dust. He had been their weapon. Now the war was over, he was simply a ghost again, an outsider stained with a violence that was not their own. He waited for the judgment, for the final weary command to leave. Chief Black Eagle stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Jed, taking in the blood, the exhaustion, the soul-deep weariness. He stopped before him, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between the two men. The chief raised a hand, not in threat, but to silence the wind itself. He spoke, and his voice was the law of the land. Nita's voice followed a soft echo, giving his words a language Jed could understand. He says you came to us as a shadow running from your own deeds. Jed met the chief's eyes, accepting the truth. He says you bled on our soil to protect one of our own, and a debt was born of ice. Nita paused, her own gaze softening. You fought as a warrior to protect us all, and the debt was paid in blood. The chief took another step closer, his eyes, holding Jed's, boring into the very heart of him. Now Nita translated her voice, barely a whisper. He asks what we call a shadow that bleeds and fights for a home that is not his. The question hung in the air, not an accusation, but a genuine search for a definition, for a name for what Jed had become. Keme, who had been watching from the rocks, scrambled down, the battered hat clutched in his hands. He ran to Jed, not to his mother, and held it up, a gift offered a third and final time. Jed reached for it, but the chief stopped his hand. The old man took the hat from Keem. From the weathered leather tie and his own long gray hair, he removed a single dark feather. It was from a hawk, a silent hunter of the sky. With slow, deliberate movements, he tucked the feather firmly into the hat's sweat-stained band. He then held it out to Jed. "A shadow has no name," Nita said, a small, weary smile finally touching her lips. "A protector of the village does." Jed took the hat. It felt heavier now, weighted with a significance he could barely comprehend. He slowly placed it on his head. It settled not as a shield against the world, but as a crown of belonging. The hole from a stray bullet, the tear from a branch, the dark stains of 100 lonely campfires, they were all still there. But now, so was the feather. A mark of honor. A claim. He looked at the faces around him. He saw no fear, no suspicion. He saw acceptance. He saw family forged not of blood, but of shared battle and mutual sacrifice. The ghosts of his past were silent at last. The vulture was dead. The Cheyenne woman's face was gone from the heat haze. There was only the quiet canyon, the setting sun painting the rocks in hues of gold and rose, and the profound, aching, beautiful feeling of being finally home. And so the tale of Jedediah Stone comes to a close. Not with the lonely silhouette of a rider against the sunset, but with a man standing his ground, surrounded by the family he earned in a trial of blood and ice. His journey reminds us that redemption isn't found by outrunning our past, but by turning to face it, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are not silver, but a moment of grace and a place to finally lay your hat. What do you think was Jed's final piece earned, or was it a debt he could never truly repay? Let me know in the comments below, and if his story moved, you be sure to hit that like button.